Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? They say murder three. Strange things that happen here. No stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.
Welcome to Strange Things, broadcasting from the Arkanasa Radio Studios in Laredo, Texas. And welcome to the show. I'm your host, Chris James. Tonight we will be talking about the Black Knight satellite. But first, once more, y'all want to make a note on your calendar. September 30th, 2018. Ricardo Rodriguez will be taking on the Laredo Kid, 820 Gale Street, here in Laredo, Texas. That's the Iron Body Gym, right behind Texas Discount Furniture Warehouse. The first match will be at 6:30. So get there in time to enjoy some of the food they'll have on site. It's only $10 at the gate. The kids are $3 each, and it's BYOB. Now come on down and cheer on your favorite, or just enjoy the evening with the family. That's Sunday, September 30th at 820 Gale Street, here in Laredo, Texas. Way back, when I was in grade school, I remember being told that the Earth had two moons. There was the one we could see at night, and then there was a second moon that circled the Earth, but it was too small to see with the naked eye. This came up on many occasions as we moved from year to year. Then it just kind of faded away. No one mentioned it after that. I used to wonder what happened to our other moon. And then I found out. It wasn't a moon, but a satellite. A dark satellite. Dark as in no one knew where it came from or why it was here. The Black Knight is an artificial satellite of extraterrestrial origin which has orbited Earth for a long time. Some say it's only been here for a few hundred years, and others say it's more like 13,000. The only way we'll ever know for sure is if NASA sends a reconnaissance probe to the object, and then they're willing to tell us the truth once they get there. Unfortunately, you know what Richard C. Hoagland says about NASA. It stands for Never a Straight Answer. Should NASA ever find out what the Black Knight is, they will never tell us. It's a national security thing, you know. The folks in charge, I don't mean the ones we elect every so often, but the real power, the guys who tell our elected officials what they want them to know, will never let us, the taxpayers, know what is really going on. Back in 1899, Nikola Tesla was doing some experimental work on one of his many inventions. He began hearing what sounded like radio messages coming from outer space. He believed he was hearing communications coming from Mars. Later on, Tesla thought maybe the communications could have been from farther away. With no means of figuring it out, he had just made a guess. Tesla might have been listening to the Dark Knight, and he didn't know it. He wasn't hearing voices. It was more like a rhythmic electronic pulse. Since the 1930s, astronomers worldwide have been reporting strange radio signals which might be coming from the Black Knight. Back then, they didn't have a name for the satellite. It was simply some unknown object in outer space. As space exploration improved, using bigger and better telescopes and radio dishes, more attention began to focus on this anomalous object. 1954, UFO researcher Donald Keyhoe told newspapers that the U.S. Air Force had reported that 2 satellites orbited Earth and had been detected. At that time, no country had the technology to launch a satellite. The St. Louis Dispatch and the San Francisco Examiner wrote about one of the satellites on May 14, 1954. They didn't give it a name yet. They only called it the satellite. Donald Edward Keyhoe was born June 20, 1897. He died November 29, 1988. He was an American Marine Corps pilot, writer of aviation articles and stories, and in a variety of leading publications, and manager of the promotional tours of aviation pioneers, especially of Charles Lindbergh. They always know when to call. Some telemarketer wanting to sell me something, or more than likely some charity wanting me to give them money. I wish they would give me money. A Keyhoe article, Flying Saucers Are Real, appeared in January 1950 issue of True. In 1956, Keyhoe co-founded the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, also known as NICAP. Any of y'all in the UFO world will recognize that name. In 1980, saw the last publication of NICAP's newsletter. The organization dissolved later that year. NICAP's archives of UFO sighting cases files was subsequently purchased by the Center for UFO Studies, or CUFOS. On August 23, 1954, a technology magazine called Aviation Week and Space Technology released a story talking about this new low-Earth satellite that got the attention of the government. The Pentagon had been keeping a lid on the story, only to have it blown open by the magazine article. The Sputnik wouldn't be launched until October 4, 1957, 3 years later. The fact that one of the satellites was moving from pole to pole really worried the military because at the time, not only didn't they have any satellites in orbit, but the direction of travel was beyond anything they were even working on. At the behest of the Pentagon, Dr. Lincoln La Paz from the University of New Mexico came out and said these satellites were not man-made but naturally occurring masses. In other words, they were tiny moons. One satellite was about 400 miles out, while the other track was 600 miles from the Earth. The Pentagon thought momentarily that the Russians had beaten the U.S. to space exploration. They sure didn't want the public to know that the Russians were so far ahead of us. The New York Times wrote their own version, telling of the discovery of the 2 objects orbiting the Earth. They pretty much just said the same things as Aviation Week, only being a huge newspaper, they received a lot more attention. In a matter of days, the story was all over the country. Despite what the Pentagon had said, a lot of folks didn't believe the objects were natural, as the chances of capturing 2 asteroids by the Earth's gravitational field was nearly impossible. People began to talk about how the close proximity of Mars that year was the real answer, and these 2 objects were probably from there. The story the government was trying to sell just wasn't believed. The number of UFO sightings was on the rise that year as well. By November 1954, just about everyone was talking about these 2 mystery objects that were circling the Earth. Radio host Jim Mills decided to use the subject for his radio show, He came out on WGN in Chicago talking about the satellites. His guest for the evening was John Odo, a well-known UFO investigator. November 28, 1954, at radio station WGN in Chicago, the two satellites were the topic of conversation. The radio host, Jim Mills, and his guest for the day, UFO researcher John Odo, were going to talk about what was going on in outer space. Odo was a UFO and paranormal researcher who was referred to as a villain and a scoundrel by the CIA. They didn't like him, and he shared their sentiments. The two had an idea to try to communicate with one of the orbiting satellites. Not wishing the government to show up prior to the broadcast and seize their show notes, the two kept their plans secret up until the day of the show. At 11:15 during the radio show, Mills made an announcement that they were going to send a signal to the orbiting satellite. They wanted to see if the aliens would answer. Maybe interview them on the radio. They announced their intentions just 10 minutes before they would send out the message. At 11:25, they would prompt the aliens to send their message with the words, "Come in outer space." Both Mills and Odo were worried someone from a letter agency like the CIA or the FBI or the NSA, that kind of thing, would back a truck up to the rear of the studio and try to jam their signals. Mills announced once they had sent the request to spacemen, they would shut off the microphones in the studio for 15 seconds. They would, however, continue to broadcast their signal to the Chicago audience. Hopefully, the aliens would tap into the WGN transmitter and send their signal to the radio listeners, whatever it might be. Everyone listening to WGN were encouraged to run and get a tape recorder so they could record the signal if it did come through. A WGN was transmitting with 50,000 watts. How much power is this? In 1918, John Brinkley opened a 16-room clinic in Milford where he would surgically implant ghost testicles, that's goat testicles, into human patients. Never mind the fact that he wasn't really a doctor. When the government shut him down, he moved south into Mexico. The Mexican government, eager to get even with its northern neighbors for dividing up North American radio frequencies without giving any to Mexico, granted Brinkley a 50,000-watt radio license, and construction began on XER-AM, his new border blaster, across the bridge from Del Rio and Via Acuña, Coahuila, better known today as Ciudad Acuña, the sunshine station between the nations. At night, John Brinkley could be heard in Paris, France. Well, right at 11:25 p.m., Mills uttered the words, "Come in outer space," and then turned off their studio microphones. The two men had a radio in the studio, so they, along with the listening audience, would be able to hear any alien message that might come through. Everyone was focused on the radio, sitting there in the middle of the studio. They sat and waited the requisite 15 seconds, but no one in the studio heard anything come over the radio. The show ended, and the two men left the station en route to their homes. While these men were away from the studio, calls began to come in. There were 4 calls altogether from people who said they had heard the aliens' message. The calls came in from varying places around the radio's listening audience. Even the CIA had been listening. They have documents revealing that 5 Chicago ham radio operators also claim to have taped weird coded messages coming from outer space. A listener in Wisconsin stated he had made a tape recording of the message as well. 2 elderly sisters, Marie and Mildred Meyer, who lived just north of the station, called in to castigate the station for trying to play tricks on their listeners. The sisters said as soon as Mills had said, "Come in outer space," they heard what sounded like jingle bells or something along those lines being played over the radio. The station reassured the 2 sisters they had not played any music during the show. One of the sisters said she had taped the program and she was willing to let them listen in. The next day, John Odo met with the women to get their story. They told him how they had listened in the night before, and then they played the tape. Odo was able to make a copy of the recording. The tape was then played a number of times over the air. It did sound a bit like jingle bells, like a tinkling of bells or chimes, with some sort of a strange telex noise in the background. In 1955, the Meyer sisters reported on their UFO experience, telling about how they had listened to the radio show and recorded some kind of a signal from outer space. Their story was written up in the Journal of Space Flight. Well, the Office of Scientific Investigation at the CIA saw the article and they contacted the Scientific Contact Branch in order to recover the tape. The CIA either wanted to listen to the tape or they wanted it to go away. 2 CIA operatives from the Chicago Division, Chief George O. Forrest and Officer DeWalt Walker, met with the sisters in an effort to get their hands on the tape. The CIA had been claiming they had no involvement in the UFO phenomena, other than the fact that they had paid for the Robertson's panel in 1953. The Robertson's panel was convened to respond to widespread and massive amounts of reports of UFOs. It is believed the CIA was behind the creation of the panel. Their mission was to determine whether UFOs instituted a threat to the United States. The panel concluded that UFOs did not pose a threat to the United States, but the continued reporting of them could cause a communications hazard. It also recommended keeping a close eye on UFO groups and people interested in UFOs sightings. Perhaps the CIA thought witnessing an unknown aerial vehicle constituted a greater threat to the country than an actual alien invasion. The CIA agents could not tell the Meyer sisters they were from the CIA, so instead they dressed up to look like Air Force officers and then told the 2 women they were there investigating UFO reports and they wanted to take the tape recording with them in order to study it. Back in 1952, the Air Force was pretending to look into UFO sightings under Project Blue Book. They were actually trying to make the public think UFO sightings were nothing to worry about. Any sighting was looked at in an effort to come up with an explanation, no matter how ridiculous, just so people would think there was nothing going on over the United States. So these 2 men tried to fool the 2 sisters into handing over the tape. The women were impressed to think the Air Force was interested in their alien recording. They wanted to help out with Project Blue Book and get to the bottom of the UFO investigations. They wanted to do their patriotic duties. But the 2 sisters also believed they had a very important recording, and they refused to part with it. the CIA had to go back to their hiding place empty-handed. Now, headquarters wanted that tape, so the two tried once more to get the Meyer sisters to relinquish the recording. The sisters dug in their heels and said no once again. They did agree to make a copy, which was handed over to the fake Air Force officers. The copy was sent away to CIA headquarters. It was analyzed, and no one could prove it was a fake or manufactured by the sisters. The Chicago office were told to keep an eye on things. I tried to find a copy of the recording, but search as I did, there don't seem to be any out there. I also looked to see if Billy Meyer was any relation to the two sisters, but I could find no connection between the two. For those two guys out there that don't know it, Edward Albert Meyer, or Billy Meyer, was born on February 3, 1937. He is a Swiss citizen who is the source of many photographs of unidentified flying objects, which he presents in support of his having contact with extraterrestrial beings. He also presented other material during the 70s, such as metal samples, sound recordings, and film footage. Some folks tried to say Billy was faking his photographs and videos. They said he was holding his camera in one hand, and the UFO was a model he held in the other hand, out by a stick and a string. These folks never bothered to actually talk to Billy. See, he only has one arm. This would make his hoaxing the photographs really hard, if not impossible. In 1957, a NICAP researcher, Leon Davidson, talked to the Meyer sisters, and then he wanted to talk to the Air Force officers who had recovered the tape. He was very interested in finding out what the government had learned from their analysis. Davidson wrote to the address that DeWalt had given to the sisters, and he received a reply stating that the tape had been forwarded to the proper authorities and there was no further information available. Leon Davidson guessed that the phony Air Force officers were actually CIA agents, so he wrote to Eisenhower's Director of Central Intelligence, Allen Dulles, demanding the results of the tape analysis and the real identity of the fake Air Force personnel. Dulles did what the CIA normally does in such cases. He reported Davidson to the FBI as being a possible subversive, and then Dulles created a new lie. The Air Force was contacted by the chief of the Chicago CIA office and told to write a letter to Davidson, falsely telling him that the Air Force officers were in fact real officers, and the tape had shown only Morse code from a known U.S. radio station. J. Arnold Shaw, assistant to Allen Dulles, wrote Davidson on May 8, 1957, saying that the CIA had nothing to do with any UFO tape recordings, and Davidson would be contacted shortly by the Air Force in regards to the Meyer tape. Davidson again contacted the CIA, demanding to know the identity of the Morse code operator and the name of the agency that had done the analysis claimed by the Air Force. As the CIA had claimed the tape was not analyzed by them, they were in a situation where they didn't know what to do. A CIA officer posing as an Air Force officer contacted Davidson and promised to try to get him the name of the Morse code operator and the identification of the transmitter if possible. This was done to stall the investigator and to buy more time so they could come up with their next lie. When Davidson continued asking questions and insisting on answers, the CIA sent another agent dressed up to look like an Air Force officer. This time they met in New York. The CIA agent tried to convince Davidson that the tape was in someone else's department, but there was nothing to hear worth listening to. When asked, the fake Air Force officer again had to pretend he would look further but wasn't sure anything could be done. Davidson would not accept the argument, and he pressed on, so the officer agreed to see what he could do. The general rule for the government seems to be keep lying until you get it right. Davidson went to his congressman and told Representative Carth he was not only being given the runaround, but he was being lied to as well. Representative Carth gave Davidson a letter to give to the CIA, instructing them to come clean with what they knew about the Meyer tape. The CIA contacted Representative Carth and told him that the CIA had nothing to do with UFO investigations, with the exception of the Robertson panel. They went on to say the tape had been picked up by the Air Force and they were handling all the details of its inquiry. They said the CIA has not participated in any flying saucer activity and has referred all correspondences to the Air Force. Mr. Davidson's belief that this agency is involved in the flying saucer furor and is using this as a tool in psychological warfare is entirely unfounded. His indication that CIA is misguiding personnel in leading them to believe in flying saucers is also entirely unfounded. Thinking they were making headway, the CIA then contacted Davidson and told him a thorough check of their records showed that the Meyer tape had been painstakingly examined, and the sounds were coming from a very much terrestrial source, and all notes and records had been destroyed along with the tapes in order to conserve storage space. Knowing he was getting the runaround by the CIA, Davidson told the agent he and his agency, whichever it was, be it CIA or Air Force, were behaving like Jimmy Hoffa and the Teamster Union by destroying records which might indict them. Davidson's last encounter with the fake Air Force officer led to a rash of internal memos within the CIA, all regarding him. Anyone having dealings with Davidson were warned that he had already been told way too much information and he had been given too many names. No one was to answer anything from Davidson unless the letter was registered. They were reminded that they were under no legal obligation to answer questions from the public. FOIA hadn't been invented yet. Oddly enough, ignoring Davidson seemed to work because after a few months of not hearing from the government agents, Davidson just kind of gave up. He stopped pushing for answers and he stopped bugging his representative for help. Here is a side note. You don't call them congressmen. Congress is the entire bunch, both House of Representatives and the Senate. The senators are in the Senate and representatives are in the House of Representatives. The House of Representatives are there in Washington to give the people who elected them a voice. Unfortunately, they don't listen very well. At one time, the Senate was appointed by the state legislators to give the states a say-so in what went on in Washington. Back in 1787, according to Article 1, Section 3 of the Constitution, the Senate of the United States shall be composed of 2 senators from each state, chosen by the legislators thereof for 6 years. The framers believed that in electing senators, the state legislators would cement their ties with the national government. In essence, the senators would serve as state ambassadors to the federal government. Woodrow Wilson wanted to sneak some laws into place, but he knew the states would never go along with it. The idea was to try to centralize power into Washington and take some of it away from the states. So he got some of his cronies to present a bill to change the law from state legislators appointing senators to getting them elected by popular vote. Wilson was also the president when the Federal Reserve was put in place, as well as income tax. And on that happy note, we're going to take a brief pause and play a couple of commercials, so don't go away. We'll be right back after this. You're listening to Arkanasa Radio. Did you hear a bump in the night and you think it just might be a ghost? Contact the Laredo Paranormal Research Society at laredoparanormal@hotmail.com. That's the LPRS for all your otherworldly needs. If you need to squint and hold things out at arm's length to see them, maybe you should get your eyes checked. Del Norte Optical, 107 Calle del Norte, is right across from the Embassy Suites. Stop squinting and start seeing. Coffee makes the world go round. And around here, we have the Organic Man Coffee Trike, 4501 McPherson, Suite number 9. If you're not looking for coffee, try their tea. It's the best in town. And remember, life is too short to drink bad coffee. Are you taking care of your skin? Or are you going to wait and see how time treats you? Take care today by contacting Lourdes James, Independent Beauty Consultant, at 956-723-3019. Don't let time get the best of you. This is Arkanasa Radio you've been listening to. And welcome back to the show. Getting back to the Black Knight satellite. In 1957, Dr. Luis Carolus of the Communications Ministry in Venezuela photographed the unknown satellite while trying to take pictures of Sputnik as it passed over Caracas. Using a huge telescope and a camera, he got the first images of the object. The unknown object seemed to be shadowing the Sputnik satellite. This was odd because the unknown satellite had been orbiting from pole to pole, but Sputnik was traveling around the equator. It would seem as if the unknown object had changed its trajectory. In March of 1960, the mysterious satellite was being tracked as it orbited Earth. The mystery satellite was in the polar orbit once more, which was the feat that neither the U.S. nor Russia were capable of at that time. The Soviet satellites were inclined at a 65-degree angle to the equator. It was calculated that the weight of the object had to be somewhere around 15 tons, which is far too heavy for any rockets of that time. It also traveled twice as fast as any kind of satellite at the time. The object was sighted and studied by many of the astronomers across the country. Robert L. Johnson, director of the Adler Planetarium, had to say this about the object. The object doesn't even have the decency to maintain a regular schedule like any other heavenly or man-made object I have ever seen. We don't know when to watch for it, he said. It appears some nights, and some nights it doesn't. The military attached so much importance to this mystery satellite that they created a special committee to gather information and study the satellite. The committee's findings were kept secret, and the sightings were brushed under the carpet. That is, until ham operators began intercepting a strange signal coming from the mystery satellite. The signal was later studied by Scottish astronomer Duncan Lunan. The decoded message showed a star map centered on Epsilon Bastis, as seen from the Earth 13,000 years ago. The press labeled the object the Black Knight. No one knows who came up with the name, but it was seen in print in 1960. A Time magazine had an image along with the Black Knight satellite inside one of their magazines. September 3rd, 1960, 7 months after the satellite was first detected by radar, a tracking camera at Grumman Aircraft Corporation's Long Island factory was also able to take photographs of it. People on the ground had been occasionally seeing it for about 2 weeks at that point, using telescopes. Viewers would make it out as a red, glowing object moving in an east-to-west orbit. Most satellites of the time, according to a material I've seen, been able to find on the Black Knight satellite, moved from west to east. Its speed was also about 3 times as fast as a normal man-made satellite. A committee was formed to examine it once more, but nothing more was ever made public. The government kept looking into it, but they also kept not telling anyone what they were finding. This could be the Black Knight satellite only having changed its orbit pattern once more. In his book, Disneyland of the Gods by John Keel, he tells about some signals that have been detected coming from and going to the Black Knight. He told about how in February 1960, the U.S. detected an unknown object in polar orbit, which he explained was a feat that neither they or the USSR had been able to accomplish. As if that wasn't enough, it apparently was several sizes larger than anything either country would have been able to get off the ground. The object was about 20 feet long, and it looked to weigh about 15 tons. John Alva Keel, born on March 25, 1930, and died July 3, 2009. He was an American journalist and influential ufologist who was best known as the author of the Mothman Prophecies. We've talked about John Keel on the show in the past. In 1963, astronaut Gordon Cooper was supposed to have reported a UFO sighting during his 15th orbit in Mercury 9 capsule that was supposedly confirmed by a tracking station. But there's no evidence that this actually happened. According to a letter from Cooper, he stated he had not seen anything while in orbit. Now, this doesn't mean Cooper didn't believe in flying saucers. In fact, he testified before the United Nations in regards to flying saucers. He had seen a few of his own, but not while in the Gemini program. According to monitoring agents around the world, the Black Knight satellite has been transmitting radio signals for over 50 years now. Some folks say they were able to decipher these signals. Then the government comes out and says there's nothing there. NASA keeps saying the Black Knight satellite is simply debris left over from space launches. They never try to explain why people would have seen space junk 50 years ago before our planet's exosphere became a junkyard. The US and Russia have shown a lot of interest in this unidentified space object. For a piece of junk, both governments are paying a lot of attention to it. The satellite is being tracked all of the time by several installations around the world. The official story is they want to know where this space junk is so that no other satellites run into it. But they're also listening to it and recording any transmissions coming from the dark night. In a related report, I found this tidbit that sounds like it belongs in the same file. In 1969, Apollo 10 astronauts, Stafford, Cernan, and Young, were the first to film an extraterrestrial space beacon dubbed the Monolith. If you saw the movie 2001 by Arthur C. Clarke, when the astronauts are on the moon and they dig up that huge black rectangle, the monolith is supposed to look like it, only not as big. The Apollo 10 astronauts were not the first people to see this weird space object. Yuri Gagarin saw it when he was the first man into outer space back in 1961. Gagarin saw something floating through space that he described as being a black rectangular box of some kind. Alan Shepard is also supposed to have seen this space object that some folks called the beacon. When the crew of Apollo 10 were filming the beacon, they said it looked like it had a message written on its side. That and a star map showing where the beacon is supposed to have come from. The Apollo 10 astronauts brought back the film that had the message recorded on it. The CIA jumped on it, even though they don't have anything to do with UFOs. The film was secreted away and everyone involved was sworn to secrecy. Whether or not this is true, I can't say, but I don't expect the government to ever come clean on anything they find out there. Later on, 1972, the government sent up an early version of the space shuttle, or a space plane, in an effort to recover the space beacon. They grabbed it and brought it back to Earth. The space beacon was either taken to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base or Area 51. Another report said the beacon, or monolith, was taken to a secret underwater base just north of the Bahamas, a place named Abaco, which has a government-contracted RCA research facility for studying electronics. The first folks to have contact with the space device are supposed to have died shortly thereafter, so the beacon had to be sealed inside some protective shielding. Did you ever see the movie The Andromeda Strain? I can see something like that happening today with all the space exploration going on in several countries today. Some of these countries aren't going to the extremes they should when dealing with objects brought back from outer space. A bacteria can survive in outer space and then come alive once it's in our atmosphere. Kind of spooky, really, just like the movie. Once again, I don't know if this report actually happened, but there are several files out there claiming it was true. Another weird item out in space that has attracted a lot of attention is the moons of Mars. In Greek mythology, Mars had two sons, Phobos and Deimos. So, when astronomers discovered Mars had two moons, they naturally named them for the Greek god's two offspring. In March 1960, Dr. Fred Singer, the White House science advisor, announced after careful examination of the moons around Mars, they had found Phobos to be hollow. This, combined with its unusual shape, led him to believe that the moon was actually an artificial satellite. He went on to say he believed the satellite had been placed in orbit around Mars by early inhabitants of the red planet. A Russian scientist has also come to the same conclusion as Singer. In October 2012, astrophysicist Dr. Isif Semyonovich Shklovsky concluded the orbital motion of the Martian satellite Phobos and came to the conclusion that the moon was artificial as well as hollow, and therefore it was a gigantic spaceship. Mars's two moons, Phobos and Deimos' names translate into fear and horror. As Mars is named after the god of war, the names seem appropriate. Both satellites were discovered in 1877 by U.S. astronomer Asaph Hill, who never guessed they might be artificial. Weird things have happened any time Mars and its moons are studied up close. In March 1989, the Russian spacecraft Phobos 2, programmed for intense study of the geology of the red planet, disappeared from the Russian tracking system as it was performing a preliminary survey of the Martian surface. As the space probe was approaching Phobos, it caught an image that looked like a huge elliptical shadow on the surface of the Mars. The shadow was of something about 16 miles long that no one had ever seen before. Then the space probe simply vanished. Then, on August 21st, 1993, the Mars Observer probe, sent to map and detail the surface of the red planet, was lost just as it was preparing to make its Mars orbital insertion. All contact with the U.S. probe were lost. In 1972, the Mariner 9 probe brought back evidence of unusual pyramidal structures on Mars's surface in the Elysium Quadrangle, and NASA's 1976 Viking 1 and 2 probes of the red planet relayed images of a face and pyramidal complex in the Cydonia site on Mars. This is the famous face on Mars. NASA rushed out and said there was nothing to see here. Move along. Well, NASA finally sent a second probe to take another look at the same location. The photos they released were laughingly called the Catbox images by Richard C. Hoagland. The images were pixelated and blurry. You'd think NASA could afford better cameras than the ones they seem to be using. The images actually look as if someone had used Photoshop to blur the photo to make it look like nothing but a pile of rocks. Hoagland went on to say, Phobos is in fact an ancient extraterrestrial, very battered 15-mile-long spaceship. Speaking of moons, how about our own moon? NASA has said the moon is at least 4.6 billion years old, and that some of the rocks were announced to be 5.3 billion years old. Not only is the moon a lot older than Earth, as measured by their best current dating methods, but there's a huge difference in the age on the moon itself, which defies explanation. The dust is a lot older than the rocks. So where did the dust on the moon come from? It's not ground up rocks. Then there are the hefty gravitational anomalies, so hefty that they have deviated space probes from their intended trajectories. It took NASA a long time to figure this out, and quite some swearing was overheard at Orbit Mission Control. These things are 10 times as strong as gravitational anomalies anywhere on the Earth. These gravitational anomalies seem to be located right over the moon's Mars, or oceans. Don't get excited. The oceans are just those great big dark splotches you see on the face of the moon. 80% of these gravitational anomalies are on the side of the moon that's facing us. The dark side of the moon is the side that is always facing away from us. You always see the same side of the moon, no matter when you look or from where. November 20th, 1969, the Apollo 12 crashed their landing module into the moon in a scientific experiment. The moon rang like a bell for over an hour. NASA claimed this was due to the sound waves passing through the moon's core. If the moon were not hollow, why would it ring? And try this sometime. Take a bowling ball and thump it with a spoon. Do you hear it ring like a bell? Of course not, because it's not hollow. This tells me that our moon is in fact hollow. This was proven by the Apollo 12 tests. If it's hollow, and if it's a lot older than the Earth, just what might we find inside of it, and where did it come from? In his book, Penetration, Ingo Swann described how he was asked by the government to remote view some coordinates on the moon in 1975. Ingo said, "Well, you won't like this, I guess. I see, or at least I think I see, well, some actual lights. They're giving off a green light. I see 2 rows of them. Yes, sort of like the lights at a football arena. High up banks of them. Up on towers of some kind. Well, Axel, it can't be the moon. I guess I must apologize. I seem to be getting somewhere here on Earth. I saw some kind of people busy at work on something I could not figure out. The place was dark. The air was filled with fine dust, and there was some kind of illumination like a dark lime green fog or mist. The thing about them was that they were either human or looked exactly like us, but they were all males, as I could see since they were all butt-ass naked. I had absolutely no idea why. They seemed to be digging into the hillside of a cliff. I think they've spotted me, Axel. They were pointing at me. How could they do that, unless they have some kind of a high psychic perception, too? Remote viewing is just your mind sending out tentacles to see what it can observe in some far-off distant point of reference. Kind of like a TV signal that only you can receive. The nasty, noisy, negative naysayers keep lecturing us as to why space aliens can't come to our planet. It's too far, they say. It would take thousands of years to get here. Once again, we're expected to believe aliens are zipping back and forth through space in their little flying saucers, coming and going like commuters going to work each day. Since the moon is so much older than the Earth, and it's hollow, and we don't really know where it came from, perhaps the moon is some kind of a gigantic space station that came here long ago and is currently inhabited by beings who wish to keep an eye on us. The dark night could be their relay station or communication satellite, so they can send messages back and forth without having to wait. You know how much fun buffering is. Apollo 11, 12, 14, 15, 16, and 17 all went to the moon. And 12 American astronauts walked on the surface of the moon. Why did Apollo 18, 19, and 20 get scrapped? After the final manned moon landing of Apollo 17 on December 11, 1972, NASA terminated the entire lunar expedition. This, despite the fact that the next Saturn V rocket, the lunar module, and the astronauts were already paid for and waiting to be deployed. Does it seem as if something or someone had told us to stay away from the moon? In an historic example of wasting money, Apollo 18 was left to rust away even though it had already been built and paid for. 19 and 20 were in the works as well. The Black Knight satellite has its own Facebook page. Check it out. Just type in the name. So, if you're not one of those folks who thinks we're it, so if you are one of those folks who thinks we are it, there are no flying saucers or visitors from distant galaxies, then the idea of the Black Knight as well as the space beacon are just so much space junk floating around our planet, and Phobos is nothing but a really weird moon. If, on the other hand, you think we're not alone, space aliens have been visiting us for thousands of years, and there are things in our solar system that just might be from some other system, then what do you suppose the Black Knight really is? Could it be some kind of a satellite placed there eons ago to keep an eye on us? Is there some group of aliens living on some distant planet, or maybe inside our moon, that want to know what we're doing? Keeping an eye on us as we grow technologically? Or could the Black Knight be a relay station, sending out its signal every so often to some distant star system? Should E.T. wish to phone home, wouldn't he need some kind of a signal booster to get his call out to whichever system he calls home? I hope you liked tonight's show. If you did, tell your friends. If you hated it, don't say anything. You can find all the past shows in the archives at strangethings.podomatic.com. You can write to me at strangethings@arkanasa.com. Until next week, this is Chris James. I hope you enjoyed the show.
Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? This ain't murder 3. Strange things that happen here, no stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.